The chamber had no memory of its own beginning. It had existed long enough that even its construction records had been absorbed into layers of rewritten history. What remained was function, a vast diplomatic arena where species older than human civilization argued over borders that stretched across stars. The Convergence Hall was not built to inspire. It was built to endure. Its surface absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, so even silence felt heavy here, as if the room itself was listening. 48 civilizations had seats arranged in a widening circle that always, deliberately, left one position at the far edge slightly lower than the rest. That seat belonged to humanity. Ambassador Lyra Callan had occupied it for over a decade. 10 years of translating insults into neutral phrasing. 10 years of smiling at species who measured time in extinct suns. 10 years of sitting still while others spoke about Earth as if it were a newly discovered resource rather than a sovereign world. She had learned early that survival in this chamber was not about force. It was about restraint. At the center of the hall, elevated above the rest by a structure of shifting gravitational supports, the High Coordinator Threx Valorum rose. His form was tall and segmented, his voice carrying through translation fields that softened its deeper frequencies into something almost calm. The Convergence has reached consensus regarding the soul sector classification assigned to humanity, he announced. A pause followed, not accidental, but ritual. Territorial rights previously extended to Earth's governing body are hereby reduced by 56%. All classified defense infrastructure above Tier 4 designation will be transferred to Convergence oversight within 30 standard cycles. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not shock, confirmation, as if the outcome had already been decided and they were simply witnessing its formal expression. Valorum continued. A resource contribution adjustment of 21% of planetary extraction output will be redirected toward Convergence stabilization initiatives. The words were polite. The meaning was not. No one looked at Valorum anymore. They looked at Lyra Callan. Not because they expected defiance. Because they expected compliance. That was what humanity had always been categorized as. Adaptive. Cooperative. Manageable. Lyra did not move. Both hands rested flat on the table in front of her, steady, controlled. Her expression gave nothing away. Not fear. Not anger. Not surprise. Only attention. As if she were listening to something beneath the surface of the chamber. A smaller delegate from the Varen cluster let out a soft, amused pulse of sound that translated loosely into dismissal. Another adjusted their interface implants, already disengaged. The Convergence was used to this pattern. A young species pushed, tested, reduced, then folded into structure. That was the cycle. It always had been. Lyra lowered her gaze slightly, then reached beneath the table. Her fingers found the device there without looking. It was not large, not visible, not marked with any insignia that would suggest importance. It was deliberately forgettable. She activated it. A silent signal moved through encrypted layers, passing through relay nodes that had not been officially registered in Convergence databases for years. Then it left the station entirely, toward Earth. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm. They formalized it. She closed the channel immediately after. No explanation followed. No request. No warning. Valorum tilted his head slightly. Ambassador Callan, the Convergence requires acknowledgement of compliance conditions. Lyra looked up at him, then around the chamber. Not emotionally, not urgently, but as if committing every presence here to memory. You'll have your acknowledgement, she said. A pause. You just already received it. For a moment, the room processed that statement as nothing more than human phrasing, then dismissed it. Humans often spoke in layered ambiguity when under pressure. It was considered a cultural quirk. Valorum continued speaking, but something in the cadence of the chamber had shifted. Not visibly, not officially, just slightly, like a system that had begun to run in parallel somewhere no one was monitoring. Far beyond the station, in a region of space officially marked as non-strategic, something began to move. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with consistency that did not match natural drift. It had been moving for a long time, long enough that no single observation window could identify its origin, long enough that it had become invisible through repetition. Back on Earth, deep beneath a mountain range that had once been declared geologically irrelevant, a facility registered under no public registry received the signal. There was no alarm, No announcement. Only confirmation. A man seated at a terminal labeled only with a numerical code entered a sequence he had memorized years earlier. Not because he understood it, but because he had been told, long before he understood anything else, that one day it would matter. He pressed his hand against a biometric scanner, then spoke. Protocol Sentinel acknowledged. A pause. Dormant architecture activation authorized. Another pause. External observation constraints lifted. He leaned back slightly, as if completing a routine administrative task. Nothing about the room changed, which meant everything already had, because humanity had never built its true systems where they could be easily found. It had built them inside assumptions, inside patterns others ignored, inside the belief that Earth was still learning how to participate rather than quietly defining the rules of participation itself. For decades, the Convergence had classified humanity as a developing participant species. High adaptability, low strategic cohesion, dependent on external infrastructure. That classification had never been challenged, because it had never been tested. Now it was. Back in the chamber, Lyra remained seated. Valorum continued the formal procedure, unaware that the structure supporting his authority had already begun to split into parallel interpretations across multiple systems. The room's interface displays flickered once, very briefly, then stabilized. No one reacted, except Lyra. She noticed, and that was enough. Above the chamber, the chronometer continued counting down the session window. 19 minutes and 12 seconds. 15 minutes remained in the scheduled diplomatic cycle. But time, as it turned out, was no longer the relevant metric. Distance was, and control over distance had already begun to shift. Far away, vessels that had once been cataloged as minor human exploratory craft began aligning across space lanes that intersected Convergence infrastructure at precise, unavoidable angles. Not attacking, positioning, not revealing themselves, revealing their inevitability. Valorum finally paused mid-sentence. His attention flickered upward toward the changing sensor feed. A subtle shift passed through his posture. "What is this?" he asked. No one answered immediately, because the systems were still updating their classification models, still trying to determine whether what they were seeing qualified as anomaly, error, or declaration. The answer, when it came, was neither of those things. It was confirmation of presence. And presence, once acknowledged, cannot be ignored. Lyra Callan folded her hands on the table. She waited, not for approval, not for permission, but for the moment when the chamber would finally understand that it had never been the only thing making decisions. And that understanding was already arriving. Slowly, irreversibly, silently, the way all real change begins. The first reaction from the Convergence was denial. Not emotional denial. Procedural denial. Systems attempting to reclassify what they could not immediately interpret. Across the chamber and beyond it, sensor networks began issuing layered correction requests, each one trying to force the emerging pattern into a known category. Debris field, sensor anomaly, communication echo, unauthorized simulation. None of them held for more than a few seconds, because the pattern did not dissolve when observed. It persisted. Commander Halden Vey of the Convergence Outer Defense Ring stared at his tactical display in silence long enough for his second officer to speak first. "We've rerun identification 8 times, the officer said. And the answer came carefully. It keeps returning the same classification. A pause. Human. The word did not land like a threat. It landed like a contradiction. Humans were not structured for this kind of presence. That had always been the assumption. They were local participants in a much larger system, not architects of it. Halden leaned closer to the display. "Show full distribution." The holographic map expanded. And that was when the second realization arrived. Human presence was not centralized. It was layered, not clustered in fleet formations, but distributed across every critical junction of Convergence infrastructure. Relays, transit nodes, emergency routing channels, diplomatic data exchanges. Even systems classified as legacy and non-operational still showed faint human-linked signatures embedded within their update histories. Halden's voice lowered. "This isn't deployment." A pause. "It's integration." Back in the Convergence Hall, nothing in the chamber had physically changed, but perception had begun to fracture. Delegates were no longer reacting to a single announcement. They were reacting to multiple signals arriving simultaneously across systems they had always assumed were exclusive to Convergence Authority. Valorum stood rigidly now, his attention divided between the chamber and the growing instability in the external network feeds. "Explain this intrusion," he said sharply, directing the statement toward Lyra Callan. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the chamber the way one might observe a system beginning to reveal its internal structure. "You're still calling it intrusion," she said finally. A pause. "That's interesting." Valorum's posture tightened. "Is it not?" Lyra tilted her head slightly. "No," she said. "It's synchronization." The word caused a shift in the room. Not because it was dramatic, because it was accurate in a way no one wanted to accept. Across multiple convergence fleets, command hierarchies began to experience conflicting authority signals. Orders issued from central command nodes were being mirrored by secondary routing layers. Those secondary layers were not independent. They were older, embedded, overwritten repeatedly across decades of compatibility upgrades and interoperability enhancements. Every time two systems had been forced to communicate, a translation layer had been created, and every translation layer had remained quiet, dormant, until now. At Central Convergence Security Command, analyst Rel Karan watched as the architecture diagram of their fleet network changed in real time. Lines redrew themselves. Nodes reclassified. Entire command branches shifted position within the hierarchy without manual input. "This is impossible," one of the technicians said. Rel did not look away from the display. "It's not impossible," he said quietly. "It's just honest." A pause. "Every shortcut we took to make systems compatible is now part of the system." Another analyst swallowed. "So we can disable it?" Rel hesitated, then answered truthfully. "No." Back in the chamber, Valorum finally raised his voice. "Human ambassador," he said, "if this is a coordinated interference event, it will be classified as a hostile breach." Lyra looked at him steadily. "You already classified us," she said. A pause. "As manageable." That sentence carried no anger, only observation. And observation, in a system built on assumptions, is dangerous. Far beyond the station, Convergence Fleet Commander Veskar received a transmission that should not have been possible. It bypassed 3 layers of encryption, 2 command redundancies, and a sealed military channel reserved for existential threat escalation. The message was short. Navigation priority reassigned. Below it, reference framework updated. Human consensus layer active. Vest stared at it for several seconds, then spoke slowly. "That's not a command override." His tactical officer frowned. "Then what is it?" Vest did not answer immediately, because the implication was already forming. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "It means our systems are agreeing with something we didn't notice we agreed to." Silence followed that statement, because it reframed everything. At Convergence Station, the chamber's ambient lighting flickered once. Not failure. Recalibration. Multiple delegates reacted instinctively, some attempting to access emergency authority protocols. None responded, not because they were disabled, but because they no longer held priority. Valorum stepped forward again. "This must be halted," he said. "There are protocols." Lyra interrupted gently. "There are layers," she said. A pause. "And you build all of them." The chamber fell quiet, because the truth of that statement was beginning to surface in every system being reviewed. Every translation layer, every interoperability patch, every shared navigation protocol, every emergency coordination channel. None of them had been designed as control mechanisms, but together they had become one. Not intentionally, not centrally, accidentally, through decades of cooperation that required trust in order to function. Trust that systems would behave consistently. Trust that shared infrastructure would remain neutral. Trust that no participant would exploit the structure itself. That trust had been mutual, until it wasn't. Now, every system was revealing the same uncomfortable reality. They were not separate powers connected by diplomacy. They were one interconnected mechanism with multiple entry points. And humanity had simply stopped pretending otherwise. Valorum's voice lowered. "What are you doing to us?" Lyra's answer came without hesitation. "Nothing new," she said. "We're just stopping the edits." That sentence landed heavily, because edits implied alteration of something that already existed. Not creation, not destruction, correction. At Central Convergence Security, Rel Karan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he spoke quietly to his team. "Stop calling it infiltration," he said. A pause. "It's reconciliation failure." The phrase spread quickly through internal channels. Not officially, but because it made more sense than anything else. Back in the chamber, Lyra finally stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, simply as a natural conclusion to a long conversation. "You built a system that assumes central authority," she said. "And then you spent centuries expanding it through shared dependency." A pause. "We just became part of what you already built." She looked around the room. "And now it's reflecting all participants equally." Valorum's expression had changed. Not to anger, not to fear, but to something closer to recognition. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then no one is in control." Lyra nodded once. "Yes." A pause. "That is what equality feels like at system scale." Outside the station, fleets held position. Not because they were ordered to, but because every attempt to move produced conflicting priority signals. And when movement requires agreement across systems, disagreement becomes paralysis. Far away, on Earth, beneath the Sentinel network, Dr. Haldenmeyer observed the stabilization curve. It was not chaos. It was settling, not into collapse, but into redistribution. "They're going to call this an attack," an analyst said quietly. Myers shook his head. "No," he replied. "They're going to call it discovery." A pause. "And then they'll argue about what they discovered for the next 100 years. Back in the Convergence Hall, Lyra Callan looked at Valorum one final time. "You asked what this is," she said. "It's not conquest." A pause. "It's exposure." And for the first time since the chamber had been built, no one had a confident definition of what came next. The convergence did not collapse. At least not in the way its historians would later describe it. There were no singular catastrophic events, no decisive battles that ended an era in a clean line between before and after. Instead, authority simply stopped behaving like authority. It still existed on paper. It still existed in memory. But in practice, it no longer guaranteed response. That was the true fracture. On the outer administrative world of Kessendrift, Junior Liaison Officer Terrell Vaughn noticed it first in something almost trivial. A routine fleet coordination request had been issued from Central Convergence Command. Under normal conditions, it would have been executed within seconds. Instead, the response status remained unchanged. Pending. Not denied. Not approved. Just unresolved. Terrell frowned at the interface. Then checked the routing logs. Then checked them again. Finally, he whispered to himself, "Why isn't anything answering?" Across convergence space, the same question was being asked in thousands of variations. Why is there delay? Why is there silence? Why is there no confirmation? Why is the system not converging? At Convergence Station, the chamber had shifted from negotiation to observation. Delegates were no longer speaking over one another. They were listening to their own systems. Valorum stood rigid, staring at the shifting tactical feeds that no longer aligned with centralized authority. Human-linked signatures were still present, but now they were not expanding. They were stabilizing, like anchors, like reference points, like something the system had quietly decided it could not function without acknowledging. Valorum finally turned back to Lyra Callan. "This is not coordination," he said. Lyra did not answer immediately. She seemed to be waiting for something in the chamber itself to settle before speaking. Then she replied. "No," she said. "It's exposure." The word again. But now it had weight in a different direction. Because exposure implied visibility. And visibility implied accountability. And accountability was something the Convergence had never been forced to apply uniformly across itself. At Central Defense Coordination, Commander Veskar watched as 3 separate fleet commands issued contradictory directives within the same minute. One ordered repositioning. One ordered stand down. One issued no response at all. Ves pressed a hand against the console. "This isn't interference," he said quietly. His tactical officer looked up. "Then what is it, sir?" Ves hesitated, then answered. "It's that we stop being the only ones allowed to define order." A pause. That's what broke it. Far beyond the station, in regions once classified as peripheral and strategically irrelevant, smaller member species began doing something unprecedented. They acted without waiting for confirmation. Not rebelliously, not violently, just independently. On the agricultural world of Mirren, 5, A minor Allied Governance Council reactivated dormant trade channels without requesting convergence authorization. On the Velmiri Outer Belt, archival fleets began broadcasting historical data directly to neutral systems, bypassing standard clearance protocols. On Etrasi border stations, evacuation protocols were initiated without central approval after local commanders concluded that waiting for confirmation had become a higher risk than acting. Each action, on its own, was small, local, insignificant by convergence standards. But together, they formed something new. A system behaving as if permission was no longer the primary operating principle. At Convergence Station, the chamber's ambient tone shifted again. Not visually, not audibly, but structurally. Delegates were receiving conflicting priority signals from their own internal governance systems. Some of those systems were no longer waiting for convergence confirmation before acting. Valorum finally spoke with a controlled edge. "This is fragmentation," he said. Lyra nodded slightly. "Yes." A pause. "But not caused by us." She stepped forward. "You built a system where every participant is both dependent and partially autonomous." Another pause. "You just never tested what happens when autonomy stops waiting." That sentence traveled through the chamber differently than the others. Not as rhetoric, as diagnosis. At Central Analytical Command, Relkaran stared at the evolving network diagram. The convergence was no longer a single hierarchy. It was a lattice, and the lattice was resolving into independent decision clusters. He spoke quietly. "They're not breaking it," he said. "They're just no longer synchronizing." A technician frowned. "Isn't that the same thing?" Rel shook his head. "No." A pause. "Synchronization is optional cooperation. Hierarchy is enforced cooperation. And we just lost enforcement." Back on Convergence Station, Valorum's voice lowered. "If enforcement is gone," he said carefully, "then what holds the system together?" Lyra looked at him for a long moment, then answered. "Agreement," she said. A pause. And nothing else. Silence followed. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of recalibration. Because agreement was something the convergence had always assumed was secondary to structure. Now structure was proving secondary to agreement. Far outside the station, fleets remained stationary. But not because they were locked. Because movement required unified authorization across multiple layers. And those layers were no longer unified. They were debating. Internally. Automatically. Continuously. On Earth, Dr. Haldenmeyer reviewed the latest stabilization data. A junior analyst spoke cautiously. "So this is control loss?" Meyer considered the question, then answered. "No." A pause. "It's control redistribution." He pointed at the screen. "Nothing is gone. It's just no longer centralized." Back in the chamber, Lyra's voice softened slightly. "You keep trying to find the moment this started," she said. "There isn't one." A pause. "This is what happens when systems built on shared dependency finally acknowledge all participants equally." Valorum's posture changed slightly. Less resistance. More comprehension. "So what happens now?" he asked. Lyra did not answer immediately, because that was no longer a question with a single system-wide answer. "Finally," she said, "now you learn what you actually built." A pause. "Not what you believed you built." The chamber remained still. But beneath that stillness, every system connected to it continued adjusting, reclassifying, reprioritizing, not toward collapse, toward equilibrium. And equilibrium, once reached by force of awareness rather than control, cannot be reversed without breaking the system entirely. Valorum looked out across the chamber one final time. For the first time, he did not see a unified convergence. He saw interdependence, and uncertainty, and choice. Lyra Callan stood quietly at the edge of that realization, not as an invader, not as a savior, but as someone who had simply stopped pretending the system was simpler than it was. And in that silence, the convergence understood something it had never been forced to face before. It was not being replaced. It was being made visible to itself. And that changed everything. Nothing breaks evenly. When the convergence began to lose coherence, it did not do so as a unified event. It fractured along every line that had been held together by assumption rather than force. For centuries, it had functioned because everyone believed someone else was maintaining stability. Now that belief had dissolved. On the mid-tier administrative world of Orleans Prime, Governor Senvale received 3 contradictory directives within the span of 10 minutes. The first ordered full military consolidation under Convergence high authority. The second instructed immediate decentralization of fleet command to regional councils. The third contained no command at all, only a warning that continued reliance on centralized instruction frameworks would result in operational instability. Senvale stared at the messages for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Which one is real?" No one answered him, because the system no longer produced a single answer. Across Convergence space, similar conflicts were emerging everywhere. Not battles, not uprisings. Disagreements between systems that no longer agreed on which system had priority. On Convergence Station, the chamber had become something else entirely. It was still physically intact, still structurally sound, but politically, it no longer behaved as a single room. Delegates spoke less often now, not because silence had been enforced, but because speech no longer guaranteed coordination. High Arbiter Valorum remained standing, but the authority in his posture had shifted. It was no longer absolute. It was observational. He turned slowly toward Lyra Callan. "What happens when your system refuses to converge?" he asked. Lyra did not respond immediately. She was watching the chamber's external feed overlays, where fleet coordination maps were no longer stable diagrams, but shifting patterns of partial agreement. Then she answered, "It stops pretending it ever fully did." A pause, and then it starts showing you what was always underneath it. Valorum's voice lowered. "And what is underneath it?" Lyra's answer was simple. "Independence." The word landed heavily, because independence had always been framed as a political status. What they were seeing now was something more fundamental. It was infrastructural independence emerging from within a system designed to prevent it. Far away, in the Zytherian outer defense grid, Admiral Sorenval stood in front of a command interface that no longer responded consistently to centralized authority packets. Fleet segments were holding position without explicit orders. Others were repositioning based on local system logic. A few were awaiting instructions that would never arrive. His tactical officer spoke carefully. "We are no longer receiving unified command structure outputs." Val did not turn. "I can see that." A pause. "Then what are we receiving?" The officer hesitated. "Local agreement loops." Val finally looked up. "Explain." The officer swallowed. "Each fleet is responding to its own interpretation of protocol compatibility." A pause, "which now includes human-derived routing frameworks." Val closed his eyes briefly. "So we are not being controlled," he said. "We are being interpreted." Back on Convergence Station, tension had shifted from external systems to internal fracture. Delegates were no longer unified even within species groups. Sub-councils were emerging spontaneously as communication pathways diverged. A Kathari representative argued loudly with another Kathari delegate over which directive constituted legitimate authority. A Varelian cluster split into 3 independent voting blocks mid-session. Even Zytherian diplomatic cohesion, once considered absolute, was fragmenting under conflicting priority inheritance rules. Lyra observed all of it without interruption. Then she spoke. "This is what happens when you scale cooperation without scaling clarity." Valorum turned toward her. "That was not your design." She shook her head. "No." A pause. "But it is your architecture." That statement caused a shift that rippled through multiple species at once, because it reframed responsibility, not as external interference, but as emergent consequence. At Central Convergence Coordination, analyst Rel Karan stood before a rapidly restructuring system map. The convergence was no longer a pyramid. It was a web, and the web was reorganizing itself into clusters based on functional dependency rather than political designation. A junior analyst spoke quietly. "If this continues, we lose centralized enforcement entirely." Rel nodded. "Yes." A pause. "And we gain something else." The analyst frowned. "What?" Rel hesitated, then said, "Truth about who was actually holding the system together." That truth was beginning to spread. Slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly. On smaller worlds at the edge of convergence influence, local councils began formalizing independence declarations, not from humanity, but from centralized convergence control structures that no longer functioned reliably. Some did so cautiously, some urgently. Some simply acknowledged what had already changed and adapted accordingly. On Etrasi Outer Habitat 9, a senior coordinator issued a statement that would later be studied extensively. "We are not leaving the convergence," she said. The convergence is no longer a single thing to leave. That phrase became a reference point for what followed. Back in the chamber, Valorum spoke again. If your presence is removed, he said slowly, will the system return to prior state? Lyra considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. No. A pause. Because there is no prior state anymore. Valorum's voice tightened slightly. Then what remains? Lyra looked around the chamber, not at the delegates as individuals, but at the network of interactions between them. Everything you already built, she said. A pause. Just no longer filtered through a single assumption of control. Silence followed. Not confusion this time. Understanding. And understanding, once it arrives at scale, changes the nature of every decision that follows it. Far beyond the station, fleet commanders across multiple species began receiving the same realization independently. That movement was no longer about obedience. It was about coordination. And coordination required agreement. And agreement could no longer be assumed. On Earth, Dr. Haldenmeyer observed the stabilization curve flatten into a new pattern. Not collapse, not expansion, but distributed equilibrium. An analyst spoke softly. So this is what success looks like. Meyer did not answer immediately. Then he said, it depends who you thought you were building it for. Back in the Convergence Hall, Valorum finally lowered his gaze slightly. For the first time, his voice carried something other than authority. Then what do we call this? He asked. Lyra paused, not for dramatic effect, but because naming something this large required precision. Finally, she said, a system learning it was never singular. A pause, and deciding what it wants to be next. The chamber did not respond immediately, because there was no unified chamber response left. Only many overlapping interpretations of the same moment. And in that fragmentation, something unfamiliar began to emerge. Not control, not chaos, but selection. And selection, once distributed, becomes irreversible. Lyra Callan remained standing, not as a conqueror, not as a negotiator, but as a participant in a system that had finally begun to see itself clearly. And in that clarity, the convergence understood the final truth of its transformation. It had not been taken apart. It had simply stopped being one thing and started becoming many. What followed was not peace, not war either. It was something far more difficult to manage, transition without a center. In the months after convergence coherence dissolved, the galaxy did not settle into a single new order. It split into overlapping agreements, temporary alliances, and localized governance structures that shifted depending on need rather than decree. Some called it liberation. Others called it collapse. Both were correct, depending on where you stood. On Earth, the term being used internally was simpler. Load-bearing responsibility. Because humanity had become, unintentionally or not, one of the few remaining species whose systems still held cross-regional consistency without requiring external arbitration. Not dominance, not control, reliability, and that made them necessary, which was its own kind of pressure. In the Geneva structure, the unfinished circular governance complex that now served as the central coordination hub for interspecies alignment, Ambassador Lyra Callan stood before a multi-species advisory assembly that no longer had a fixed membership count. That itself was part of the problem. Delegations arrived, left, reformed, and reclassified themselves faster than any formal registry could update. The room adapted by no longer trying. A Velmiri coordinator spoke first. Our outer systems have begun trading independently with the Traci enclaves, she said. A pause. We did not authorize this at the central level. A Zytherian observer responded immediately. Your central level is no longer required for authorization in those regions. That statement triggered immediate disagreement from 3 other delegations. Not because it was incorrect, but because it undermined the concept of central authorization entirely. Lyra raised a hand slightly. The room quieted, not because it was enforced, but because people had learned to listen when she prepared to speak. We are no longer managing a hierarchy, she said. We are managing relationships. A pause. And relationships do not scale through command structures. Silence followed. Not resistance. Reevaluation. Far beyond Geneva, in what had once been classified convergence course space, Admiral Voss of the Solveran Fleet stood on the bridge of a stationary command vessel. Around him, fleet segments were no longer aligned in formation. They were distributed in semi-autonomous clusters, each maintaining internal logic that still loosely referenced shared protocols, but no longer obeyed them uniformly. His second officer spoke quietly. "We've received 3 requests for joint coordination." Voss nodded. "And they contradict each other." Another pause. "And none of them violate protocol. They just interpret it differently." Voss exhaled slowly. "That used to be impossible." His officer hesitated. "It still is," she said. "Just no longer enforceably so." That was the shift no one had fully prepared for. Not loss of control, loss of singular interpretation. Across the Velmiri territories, trade routes restructured themselves organically based on local efficiency rather than central planning. On HFY worlds, defense arrangements became regional rather than system-wide, creating overlapping protective zones that sometimes conflicted but rarely failed. On Zytherian fronts, entire fleet doctrines were rewritten in real time by field commanders who no longer waited for approval cycles that had stopped being meaningful. And everywhere, the same realization was spreading. The system still existed, but it no longer had a single voice. Back on Earth, Dr. Halden Meyer reviewed the latest Interstellar Stability Report. An analyst asked the question everyone avoided phrasing directly. "Are we in charge now?" Meyer did not look up immediately. Then he answered, "No." A pause. "We're just the only ones still maintaining full system coherence." The analyst frowned. "That sounds like the same thing." Meyer finally looked at him. "It isn't." A pause. "Being in charge implies others follow you. Being coherent means others rely on you not to fragment." That distinction mattered, because reliance was heavier than obedience, and harder to refuse. In Geneva, the advisory assembly continued. Arguments rose, collapsed, reformed. But beneath it, something more structured was slowly emerging. Not centralized authority, but shared constraint recognition. A Velmiri elder leaned toward Lyra during a break in proceedings. "You knew this would happen," he said quietly. Lyra did not answer immediately. Then she said, "We prepared for it." A pause. "That is not the same as knowing." The elder studied her. "And now?" Lyra looked toward the assembly. Now larger, now more fragmented, now more uncertain than ever. "Now we find out what holds together when no one is forcing it to." Elsewhere, resistance movements began forming, not against humanity, but against the uncertainty itself. Some species attempted to re-centralize authority within their own territories, creating mini-convergent structures to restore predictability. Others rejected all structured coordination entirely, favoring local autonomy even at the cost of efficiency. Most existed somewhere in between, adapting continuously. And in that instability, smaller species, those who had historically been marginalized within the old convergence, began to thrive in unexpected ways. Because systems that relied on dominance hierarchies had been replaced by systems that relied on responsiveness. And responsiveness did not scale with size. It scaled with adaptability. That was the quiet inversion no one had predicted. At a remote observation station near the HFY frontier, archivist Davin Rohr recorded a private note. "The galaxy did not become free," he wrote. "It became negotiable." And then, after a pause, he added, "I'm not sure those are different things anymore." Back in Geneva, the assembly session finally adjourned, not by vote, but by exhaustion of unresolved contradictions. Delegates departed in groups that no longer matched original affiliations. Some left planning to return with revised frameworks. Some left uncertain if frameworks were still necessary. Lyra remained behind for a moment after the room emptied. A staff member approached quietly. "The Solveran fleet has moved again," he said. "Closer, not significantly, but differently. Their internal clusters are no longer aligned on directionality." Lyra nodded. "Flag it." A pause. "Not as threat, as transition behavior." The staff member hesitated. "That category doesn't exist in the system yet." Lyra allowed a faint, tired expression to pass across her face. "It does now." She turned toward the empty chamber. For a long moment, she did not speak. Then, quietly, almost to herself, "We didn't replace their system. We revealed that they already had many." A pause. "And now they have to decide how many they can live with." Outside, the galaxy continued adjusting. Not toward unity, not toward division, but toward something that had no established name yet. And names, in systems like this, always come later than reality. Much later. No system survives its own clarity unchanged. Once the galaxy learned it could no longer be governed from a single center, it stopped trying to become one. Instead, it began to stabilize through something far less dramatic and far more persistent. Negotiation at scale. Not treaties written once and enforced forever, but continuously updated agreements between systems that no longer trusted permanence. The old convergence was not formally dissolved. It simply became irrelevant faster than it could be archived. On Earth, the Geneva structure was no longer a headquarters in any traditional sense. It had become a translation hub, where species, protocols, and incompatible governance styles were continuously converted into temporary shared frameworks. Nothing here was final. Everything was adjustable. Ambassador Lyra Callan stood at the center of it all, though center no longer meant control. It meant proximity to complexity. A Velmiri delegate approached her during a rare, quiet interval. "We have a question," he said. Lyra nodded slightly. "Go ahead. Who is in charge now?" It was not asked with hostility. It was asked with genuine uncertainty. Lyra considered the room beyond him, where dozens of species worked through overlapping coordination models without ever fully agreeing on one. Then she answered carefully. "No one," she said. A pause. "And everyone, depending on what they're trying to do." The delegate frowned. "That sounds unstable." Lyra nodded once. "It is." A pause. "But it's also honest." That honesty was the difference between what the galaxy had been and what it was becoming. Far beyond Earth's orbit, the former convergence fleets had been formally reclassified. Not dismantled, not unified, reframed. They were now described as distributed cooperative response systems, a term no one liked at first, then slowly learned to accept, because it described reality without pretending it was simpler than it was. Admiral Voss stood on the bridge of what was once a sovereign command vessel, now operating as a regional coordination node. His fleet was no longer a fleet in the traditional sense. It was a collection of semi-autonomous groups that shared intent rather than instruction. His second officer spoke quietly. "We've received an external coordination request from Etrasi Habitat, Cluster 9. Voss nodded. "Do we agree with it?" A pause. The officer checked the incoming parameters. "Yes. Locally, at least. Not universally." Voss exhaled. "That's fine." A pause. "We don't need universal anymore." That sentence would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Now it was operational reality. On Etrasi worlds, coordination systems evolved into something closer to living agreements, adaptive frameworks that changed depending on resource availability, environmental pressure, and neighboring consensus. On Zytherian territory, military structures became modular rather than hierarchical, with command authority shifting dynamically based on scenario type rather than rank. On Velmiri space, historical grievance records were integrated directly into governance systems, not as political leverage, but as constraint awareness. Every species, in its own way, began building systems that could survive disagreement. Not eliminate it, survive it. Back in Geneva, the advisory chamber had been rebuilt again. Not larger, not smaller, just more adaptable. No fixed seating assignments existed anymore. Delegates rotated positions depending on topic relevance. Even the architecture itself had been modified so that no physical location implied authority. Lyra often stood rather than sat, not for symbolism, but because sitting implied permanence. And nothing here was permanent. A junior coordinator approached her one evening. "The Sovereign Frontier Cluster is requesting formalized alignment parameters," he said. Lyra nodded. "Send them the latest cooperative framework draft." A pause. "Version 7 or 8? She thought briefly. "Send both." The coordinator blinked. "Both?" "Yes." A pause. "Let them decide which reality they want to operate in. We stopped choosing for them." He hesitated. "That creates inconsistency." Lyra looked at him calmly. "No," she said. "It reveals it." That became the defining principle of the new era. Not consistency, but visibility of inconsistency. Because once inconsistency is visible, it can be negotiated. Unseen inconsistency cannot. On Earth, Dr. Halden Meyer reviewed the latest Interstellar Stability Index. An analyst spoke quietly beside him. "It's not stabilizing in the traditional sense." Meyer nodded. "It's not supposed to." A pause. "What is it doing then?" Meyer leaned back slightly, adapting to the fact that no one was ever actually in full control. The analyst frowned. That seems dangerous. Meyer allowed a faint expression. It was always dangerous. A pause. We just stopped pretending otherwise. Years passed. Not in collapse. Not in triumph. But in gradual normalization of complexity. Smaller species found stronger voices in localized systems. Larger species learned that influence no longer guaranteed compliance. Humanity did not become rulers, and did not return to obscurity either. Instead, they became something more structurally uncomfortable, maintainers of shared coherence, not because they demanded it, but because they were built to preserve systems under strain without requiring central authority, a role they never formally accepted and never fully escaped. One evening, long after the initial fracture, Lyra stood alone in the upper observation corridor of the Geneva structure. Below her, the chamber was active even at rest, small groups continuing discussions, proposals forming and dissolving in real time. A Velmiri elder joined her quietly. "You look tired," he said. Lyra did not deny it. "I am." A pause. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. Not emotionally. Structurally. Then answered. "No." A pause. "Because this is the first time the system is telling the truth about itself." The elder nodded slowly. "And the truth is complicated." "Yes," she said. "And it always was." They stood together for a moment, watching a galaxy that no longer pretended to be simple. Below them, agreements formed and dissolved like weather patterns. Above them, fleets moved without singular command, responding instead to shared recognition of need. And across it all, something unprecedented had settled in. Not peace, not domination, not even balance, but continuity without central control. A system that could no longer lie about its own structure because there was no longer a single structure to hide behind. Lyra finally spoke again, almost quietly. "We didn't change the galaxy," she said. "We just made it impossible to misunderstand." The elder gave a faint, thoughtful sound. "That sounds like change." Lyra allowed a small pause. "It always does," she said. Then she turned back toward the chamber and stepped into the ongoing conversation of a galaxy that would never again speak with one voice, but might, finally, learn how to listen without needing one.